Kia ora koutou. My name is Katarina and welcome to the workshop today. I hope you can all hear me well. If you can't, there are a couple of ways to talk to me in the bottom of the screen. If you just hover your arrow on the bottom of your screen, you've got the reactions button where you can raise your hand if you want to tell me anything. And there's also the chat function where you can type in your questions, and we'll use those two functions in the meeting today if you want to ask me anything on the content or about the systems that you might already be using, composting systems, any questions on those. Very happy to answer any questions you may have. So I'll pause at a few points after each section of my presentation so you can ask all your questions. All right, I think we'll get started. Here we go. Okay, so as I said, introduction to composting, worm farms and Bokashi. I'll give a little bit of background first, why we're doing this, and then I'll introduce the three methods. And yeah, as I said, after each method, I'll do a little pause. You can ask your questions, and then we'll move on. Okay. So why are we talking about composting? Every few years, we get someone to look through our residence bins and see what the average household actually throws out. And what we've consistently found is that about half of what's in the average kapiti wheelie bin is actually food and green waste. So these are the results from the survey 2017, the last one that we did. And that stuff basically gets sent to landfill and then just sits there and rots, producing methane, which of course is a greenhouse gas. So that's not great news. And it's actually something that's relatively easy to deal with in our own homes. So that's why we're addressing that. When we did the last survey in 2017, we also did a little bit of math around what CO2 equivalent emissions we're actually getting from the rubbish that kapiti sends to landfill every year. And we came up with this number. It's actually the same as 28 trips between Auckland and London every year. That was 2017. Those emissions mostly come from the organic waste. So food, green waste, also timber, paper to some degree. But yeah, the organic waste is to blame here. And we have a goal to reduce our district's waste by 30% by 2026, which isn't actually that far away now. So hence the food and green waste is something that we're looking at. So this year we started the exciting Love Your Compost campaign. I think most of you probably would have already been on this website to book this workshop, maybe to get a voucher. So you'll be aware of it, hopefully. If you haven't looked at it yet, do get your voucher, $40 that you can redeem for a composting system of your choice. And also, you don't need to take notes on what I'm talking about today because we have most of the content is on this website as well. And if you go to the different pages on compost bins, worm farms, etc., you'll find a little link to download a little fact sheet as well that you can print and pop on your fridge. Just to remind you of the do's and don'ts and all of those things. Right, so starting with cold composting today. That's probably the system that most people are familiar with already. Lots of us have a black bin like that in our backyard, or even just a pile does just as good a job, or some sort of wooden box. Cold composting is really great if you have a lot of green waste from your garden. You can also compost your food waste. It's probably the lowest maintenance system in that you don't need to sort of give it continuous attention, but it also takes the longest to get your final compost out. So you're looking at about 6 to 9 months for that. And when I started composting, I sort of just chucked everything in and hope that it would magically turn to wonderful compost, similar to what you'd buy at the garden centre. And that didn't happen. And over time, I learned that there are actually a few tricks to make this work well. And one of them is what we call the carbon-nitrogen balance, or the balance of browns and greens. So what's that all about? Basically, you need the right mix of materials in your compost bin. And we talk about 70% browns or carbons and 30% greens or nitrogens. Carbons are things that are brown, brittle, dry, such as twigs from your garden, dried grass clippings, paper and cardboard are great if you're not generating enough of that material from your garden, dry leaves, anything like that really. And the greens or nitrogens are anything that's fresh, green, moist, such as your food scraps, any fresh leafy garden waste, fresh grass clippings, that sort of stuff. And the right balance of those materials is needed so that the microorganisms that actually work in your compost, live in your compost and make it all happen, so that they are happy and can do their job well. It's basically the greens are sort of the food that provides the heat, and the browns make sure that you have good enough airflow in there. And yeah, they really work together, and it's around that balance. You don't have to be too accurate, but about 2/3 browns, 1/3 greens is needed. And then when you build your compost, I think a sort of a nice mental picture is you could think of it as a sandwich where the browns is the bread and the greens is the filling. So you have a layer of bread, browns, and then a layer of greens, and then another layer of browns on top. What I do at home, because I often have more greens than browns, is that I actually have a little wolf edge. This one has currently a lot of hedge trimmings in it that I just have tucked away somewhere near my compost bin, so it's there when I need it. Another great source of browns is you could have a box in the garage with some cardboard, paper, newspapers, pizza boxes, toilet rolls, egg cartons. That will make great carbons if you don't have a lot in your garden. And you don't necessarily need to layer it, so you can also just mix it straight away. Just I don't know, just go 1 handful of greens, chuck a couple of handfuls of carbons in at the same time. It doesn't actually need to be layered, but the balance needs to be there. And the other thing to consider with your compost to make it work well is that your compost is alive. There are microbes working in there, turning that stuff into compost. And as well as that balance, they also need to have enough water. So something that happens quite often, especially over the summer, is that our compost bins actually get way too dry, especially if they're sitting in the sun. I mean, you can imagine a black plastic bin in the sun that gets really hot. And yeah, so watering it, I guess just checking it, does it feel moist like a sponge when you add your stuff? If it feels a bit dry, then that, yeah, just watering it. And finally, the last thing that those critters need is air. So one way to keep the airflow going in your compost is to have enough carbons. And another way is to turn it. Now, I don't turn my compost bin very often, I must admit, only turn it about twice a year or so. It's a little bit, I guess, about how quickly you want it. So if you turn it more often, it'll compost more quickly. If you can't be bothered and you don't mind waiting, then just do that. So it's actually not very hard to turn it. I found the easiest way to do it is if you've got one of those black bins, just pull it up. I guess just wriggle it a little bit, pull it up over the top of your compost contents there, and then just plonk it back down next to your now exposed heap, and then you can just fork it back in, and that way the stuff that was on the top previously is then on the bottom. And if it's been long enough, this is what this picture is trying to show, if it's been long enough, you'll find a layer of finished compost at the bottom. So probably about the bottom third or so is going to be finished compost, and you can go and use that on your garden. When you turn is also a great time to just check that the balance is looking right, it's not gone sludgy or smelly in places, or it's not too dry, so you can add your water. If it's dry, if it's sludgy and smelly, add some carbons. Another great additive to add to compost bins is just normal garden lime, or even wood ash from your fire, if you've got a wood fire. That balances the acidity and is something that those compost microbes and critters really like. So that's a good conditioner. Yeah, that's basically the trick. Now, one problem that can occur with composting is you might attract rodents, especially if you put a lot of food waste in. So one way to, I guess, avoid attracting them is to not add any of the types of food waste that they are particularly attracted to, such as meat or cooked food leftovers, processed food like bread or pasta, that sort of stuff. No dairy, no cheese, those sorts of things shouldn't really go in your compost bin. The other way is to keep your compost nice and hot. So it'll stay hot if you've got the right balance of materials in there, if it's moist enough, if it's got enough air. It's not necessarily very easy to keep it hot. That's why we call it cold composting. So you may not find that a particularly easy solution. Otherwise, you can actually rat-proof compost bins relatively easily by using a fine wire mesh. So you want a piece that's a bit bigger than the base of your compost bin. Place your compost bin on top and then just sort of wrap the mesh up on the sides, tie it on with a cable tie or a piece of wire. I've got a couple of links here on some instructions of how to rat-proof a bin, and I'll send those around with the recording. So I won't go into too much detail on that now, but it is possible. Okay, so that was a very quick rundown on the composting. There are a couple of other types of compost bins that are maybe a little bit less known that I just wanted to introduce here as well. On the left, that's called an Earthmaker. How that works is it basically has 3 chambers on the inside. And the idea is that it makes sort of aerating the compost easier because you don't have to turn it. So you start putting your stuff in the top. Then when that fills up and it's been there for a while, you can actually pull the little latch here, and it makes it fall through to the next compartment, and you put it back in, and so you can fill your fresh stuff in the top. So that middle compartment has now stuff that's been composting for a little while already, is a bit more mature. And when those fill up, you can pull this latch and it falls down to the bottom. And yeah, basically just stays there till it's finished, and then you can open it and get that out. So yeah, the idea being is that you don't have to slave with the garden fork, and it just sort of yeah, moves through that system, turning itself more or less. And the other model that makes that turning easier is the compost tumbler over here. So there's a few different types. Some have 2 compartments. But again, the idea being that you can just rotate that tumbler as you go, and it keeps your compost aerated. They're also really good in that they're rodent proof. So if you do want to compost all of your food scraps, and you don't have a huge section of a lot of garden waste, they might be quite good for you. They can also sit on a patio. Yeah, they don't really make any mess. So yeah, quite good if you think that turning the compost manually isn't for you. And they work well for schools. You can chuck all your paper in there and all of that. So that was composting very quickly. Any questions on either what I've spoken about or your compost at home? Please raise your hand or type some questions into the chat box if you want to ask anything on the composting. All right, can't see anything. We'll just move on. So the next system I want to talk about today is worm farms. Now, what I really like about worm farms is that they produce compost and fertilizer quite a lot more quickly once up and running than traditional compost bins do. They work a little bit differently in that you actually get the compost through worms eating your food scraps and then pooing them out. So your compost is actually worm poo, but it's lovely stuff. It's really nice and fine. It's really rich, easy to use in your garden. In worm farms, as you can see in this picture, so they also need a balance of greens and browns, but it's basically opposite to what a compost bin needs. So for the worm farm, you'd use 70% greens and 30% browns. So they're really great if what you have is mostly food scraps. You don't have a lot of garden waste that you want to compost. It's really about you want a solution for your food. You do still need to keep an eye on the carbons. If you just give them food, they'll get a bit sludgy and smelly in there. So I find things like egg cartons, brown paper bags, paper towels, if you use them, that sort of stuff is really good in your worm farm. The other thing that's nice about them is that they're rodent proof, so they're usually a bit off the ground, and yeah, rats and mice can't really get in. So there's a couple of different models. This one here is called a hungry bin. That's a continuous system, meaning you just keep putting stuff in the top and it keeps coming out the bottom. So it's got a little tray in the bottom here. Can you guys actually see my mouse? Yep. So that just clips off, and that's basically where you're finished, where you can take your finished worm castings from. And then the worm tea, the liquid, just drains freely. So you can see on my one, I've actually chucked a little measuring jug under here that catches that worm tea, and then you can just pour that into your watering can, water it down a bit, and that's your liquid fertilizer. So you get your worm castings, your solid fertilizer, and your liquid fertilizer out really easily. The best place to set up a worm farm is a nice shady, sheltered place, because they don't like to be cooked in the summer, and they also don't like to be too cold in the winter. So if you are living a bit closer to the mountains maybe, or somewhere where it gets really cold in the winter, might be a good idea to move it close to the house, or maybe even into the garage over winter. I haven't had any issues with that in Kapiti. Mine just stays in the same spot all year round. They seem to be quite happy, but yeah, depending on your circumstances. The other thing you need to set up a worm farm is some sort of bedding layer. So they like just a compost, maybe chuck a bit of ripped newspaper, stuff like that in there. And I guess one of the most common mistakes with worm farms is to overfeed them when they're new. So normally you'd buy your worms, or you'd get some worms from a friend or whatever. And it actually takes a little bit of time for them to, I guess, settle into their new farm and start producing eggs and offspring and just sort of really get pumping. So in the beginning, it's worthwhile just feeding them small amounts and then slowly increase as they start to get more established. So there's a few things worms don't like in terms of food waste. They don't like really strong flavored things like citrus or other really acidic fruits. They don't like spicy things like onions, garlic, chili. They also don't really cope well with cooked and processed food, bread, pasta, that sort of stuff. Leftovers, I'd only sort of give them cooked. I mean, if you have some cooked peas left over or something like that, they'll be fine, but don't give them your leftover curry. Yeah, no meat and dairy, and they're not keen on just sort of straight liquids, in particular oily stuff. This is the other sort of common system. That's a stacked system. The way that works is you actually start setting up your worms in this middle layer here. This particular type comes with sort of like a pressed fiber block bedding that you just put it in a bucket of water, and it soaks up the water, and then you can use it as the bedding. I've heard from a few people who've set up with that material is that the worms don't actually particularly like it and seem to be trying to make a getaway first thing. So I would suggest if you use that stuff, which I think you can, but maybe mix a few handfuls of compost in if you can, and do give them some food, so they're not just sitting in that stuff. Yeah, and then I guess you just chuck your food on top. You can see the contents of my one here. I've got the eggshells and potato peelings and other food scraps. Got a ripped up egg carton there. And when that first layer here is full, you basically stick the next layer on. So I've just recently done that. Slightly pitiful amount of food they've got there. But the idea is, as that top tray fills up, that the worms will gradually move up. It does take a little bit of time because there's obviously still food for them in the bottom as well. So they will also eat that first, but eventually they'll all move up. And then you can basically just lift the middle tray out and that'll be your finished worm casts, lovely compost. And yeah, I guess eventually put it back on top when this other layer fills up as well. Pretty easy, really. So then there's also this bottom tray that has a tap on it, which is where you collect the liquid, the worm tea. That's a really good fertilizer, as I've already said. You just need to water it down a little bit, sort of going for the color of weak tea. And I've dug in a little bit on the right here that you can sort of just see that really black stuff. That's the worm castings. So that's a really nice, fine, rich compost, really concentrated. I have found worm farms very easy to manage once they're going, once you've got over that sort of initial slow time. I guess a couple of things is that, like compost, worms also like to stay moist. So depending on what you give them, I give them a lot of coffee grounds sloshed out of the plunger with lots of water. So mine tend to stay moist enough. I don't normally water them, but depending on what you feed them, where they're situated, you might need to add a little bit of water just to keep it nice and moist. The other thing that's really great for worm farms is garden lime. So just occasionally sprinkling some garden lime, especially if you start to see lots of fruit flies, because they get attracted to acidity. So if you see lots of fruit flies, that means that it's probably a bit more acidic than the worms really like. Adding a bit of lime will help with that. Other than that, you might find all sorts of other critters. I always have the big tiger slugs in my worm farm. There's sort of like a native New Zealand slug that eats the dead plant material, same as the worms, but that's not really an issue. They just seem to coexist quite happily. I also have slaters in my worm farm. Same thing, they don't cause any issues. One thing I'd worry about if you see ants, because ants like dry soils and dry environments. So if you see ants in your worm farm, it's a sign that it's a bit dry. And if you give it some water, they'll hopefully leave. Right, so that was the worm farm. Any questions on the worm? No. No worm questions either. All right, moving on. So last but not least, Bokashi bins. I really like Bokashi bins because what is really great about them is that they take all of your food waste. So all of the stuff that you wouldn't put in your compost bin because you don't want to attract rats, or that you can't put in your worm farm because the worms don't like it, all of that can go in the Bokashi. So including meat scraps, including cooked food, small bones even, dairy products, the whole lot. The only things you can't put in a Bokashi bin are big bones, so like you know, your lamb shoulder bone sort of thing, or straight liquids, so I don't know, milk that's gone off or whatever, or moldy food, because it actually works with a culture that gets somewhat upset by other mold cultures. And it's a food waste only system, so no carbons, no paper or garden waste or compostable packaging. It's just for food. And it's very, very simple to use. So basically, here's a picture of my yummy food waste. You just chuck your food waste in. It comes with a sprinkle, sort of like sawdust, inoculated sawdust, inoculated with some effective microorganisms. So you chuck your food waste in. I've got my potato masher there because the system works without air. So you mash it down a bit, and the idea is to get the air out, air pockets, and then you just sprinkle that stuff on top. They say about 1 to 2 tablespoons per 6 centimeters of food. I sort of handle that a bit flexibly, and if I've got things that I know could get yucky, white meat or something, I put a little bit more in. Otherwise, that seems to work quite well. And then put the lid on top. So the trick with the Bokashi is that it's an anaerobic system. That means it works without air. And what it actually does is it pickles your food waste. So it pickles it really quickly. And if you've ever made pickles, you want to keep air out of that as well. Yeah, they're normally in an airtight container. And so it's also best to only open them once a day. Because you want to keep it airtight. So I've got a little ice cream container under my kitchen sink that I collect the stuff in during the day, and then I just chuck it in there in the evening once a day, squash it down, put the sprinkle on and put it away. When it's working well, it's got a sort of a fermenty smell. So it smells like, I don't know, a fruit punch or a pickle or something. I don't particularly mind the smell, but if you do, you can keep it outside, just somewhere warmish and out of direct sun. And I guess the good news is because it's airtight, it only smells when you open it. And if you're only doing it once a day, that's not really, I don't find that to be an issue. It's a 2-bucket system. So the bottom bucket gathers the liquid that drains from your food waste. You should empty it every 2 to 3 days. This picture is actually a picture of what happens when you leave it longer, which I regularly do. So you can see it's grown that white culture on top. That's actually the culture that does that fermenting for you. So there's nothing to be concerned about there. You can use this stuff as a liquid fertilizer, but you need to water it down lots and lots. So about 2 to 3 tablespoons of the Bokashi liquid on 5 liters of water. Or you can also just pour it down your drains. It's septic tank safe and all the rest of it, meant to be good for cleaning your drains. I don't know if that's ever been proven, but it's not doing any harm anyway. Or I actually normally just pour it into my compost bin. So you can do that as well. And oops. When your bucket is full, you leave the stuff to mature for 2 weeks. And what you'll likely see is a bit of a sort of white tufty mold growing on it. You can see that here in parts of it. And that's exactly what it should look like. Again, that's that culture growing. And then you can either put it in your compost bin if you've got one, or just dig it into the soil. So I put mine in a compost bin, and you basically treat it as a layer of green or nitrogen. So, and with that Bokashi stuff, because it's quite strong smelling and it's quite concentrated, do make sure you sort of sandwich it between quite nice thick layers of carbon. So I've prepped my compost bin here by putting in a ripped up pizza box as my carbon layer. Then that's the contents of the Bokashi. And you can see it's not a compost at this stage, right? It's just your food waste as it was in a fermented, pickled kind of condition. So it's it still looks quite similar to it did when it went in, but it's actually I guess the pickling process has broken down the internal cell structures of it. So once it's in that composting environment or in your soil, it will break down really, really quickly. But as I said, just still looks like food waste basically. So then I've topped it off with a carbon layer. This is my hedge trimmings, and again, at this stage, I add some garden lime because the Bokashi culture makes the stuff a bit acidic, and it's just to balance it so that you've got a nice end product for your garden. And that's basically all you need to do. So so if you want to use that system continuously, because you have the 2-week maturation period, you might need 2 buckets so that you can use your second one while your first one is maturing. If you haven't got a compost bin, you can also just dig it into the soil. So just dig a little hole or trench as deep as the Bokashi bin and chuck your stuff in, cover it with at least 5 to 8 centimeters of soil, and then you can plant over the top of it after 3 or 4 weeks. Or if it's, you know, just somewhere you don't mind it, you don't have to obviously plant over it, but it's very rich in nutrients. So it'd be nice for anything you do want to plant on top of it. So that's the Bokashi. All right, and I might just get out of the presentation now so you can see me, and maybe just unmute everyone for a minute if you have any questions on any of that. No questions whatsoever. Okay, so those of you who are watching the recording, you're more than welcome to send us your questions via email as well. I'll just bring that back up here. Sorry, clunky. Yep, so you can contact us via any of these channels, and more than happy to answer all your composting questions, any problems you may have had. Okay,